let's start this off with a bang. I want to talk about suffering.
Yeah.
So, when was a time, maybe in recent memory, that you suffered, that you went through something that you would consider to be suffering?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I feel as though there's been levels of suffering, and that experience of suffering, as I know it now, is different than what it's been in the past. Certainly for me, as a gay man coming out, that was a very difficult time for me when I was 19 and I was pretty religious. And there's some remnants of that still in my kind of experience with my family. And at that time, suffering was a desire to belong and a sense or a feeling about myself that something's wrong with me or that I need to fix or change myself. And this experience of suffering, I think, was, yeah, just an emotional, physical, mental, spiritual dilemma of how do I resolve these beliefs and ideas around who I am, who I should be, how to belong to my family, to my community, to my religion. And at that time, suffering was a lot of conflict, internal conflict. And I think what I've been learning about suffering is it's often a level of resistance to what is. And it's also what kind of magnifies suffering, in my opinion, can be a lot of beliefs and ideas of what should be. And we're resisting what is. So there's thoughts and beliefs about what this is should be, which have nothing to do with what it actually is. And then there's thoughts and feelings inside of us and belief systems around who we should be versus who we are. And that kind of conflicting tension is, I think, what suffering is. So, yeah, there was definitely like a whole period of kind of my 20s being in relationship is really challenging for myself and a lot of people because we're often confronted with aspects of ourselves that we're avoiding. And again, I think a theme in suffering is resistance. A theme might be to try to avoid something that we don't want to look at, or our understanding of it presents this kind of conflicting dilemma within us of like something should or should be different than what it is. So that's kind of my first round of thinking on what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful. I love that. Like, it's the rejection of what is.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally you're not accepting, and to tie that into like the in Buddhism, the three causes of suffering are craving, aversion, and ignorance.
Mm,
So craving is desiring something that isn't. Aversion is wishing something that is to not be.
mm.
And then ignorance is not understanding what is.
Yeah. I love
And
those
so,
three pieces. I almost want to like dive into each of those for a second,
yeah.
right? Because I think this craving, this kind of longing and a sense of wanting to be better, do more. I think there's an innate mechanism in us of survival and learning from our past experiences, how to improve our experience and our existence, how to survive, dangerous situations, and these kind of mechanisms around building safety, belonging, and trust, and like nervous system regulation, basically. And this longing kind of like sense of being in relationship to other people, I think that goes a lot into like attunement and polyvagal theory and ways our nervous system is trying to kind of like be in relationship to other people. So I think innately that longing is a longing for connection. And we have this direct experience of feeling separate from each other. And there's this kind of right brain, left brain dual operating system, where our logic mind is built to discern and make sense of things in relationship to each other. This phone is separate than me, you're separate than me. And so, in our separateness, tied with this energy and desire for connection, that creates this dilemma of how do I navigate my separateness? How do I meet and respond to this desire and this longing for connection? And I think, the whole right brain side of everything is just the soup can get to these more spiritual places of like, we're all in unity. We're already connected. There's actually nothing here to solve at all. But that dilemma of this kind of innate longing for both improvement, survival, connection, within the paradox of like we're all unity and in the soup together. It's kind of fun to consider like maybe there's a really intentional purpose for this sense of longing in us Yeah, I don't know. I'm wondering what's landing for you as I'm talking about all that.
Yeah, I think there's a challenge here because I see where craving in my life causes suffering, where like I genuinely, because of the fact that I'm not okay with how things are, it's more painful. It's suffering.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I see where like there are actual improvements that can come because of craving.
Yeah.
There are things that I can accomplish, or I can, like you were talking about, I can find deeper connection because of these cravings. But at the same time, I don't want to train my mind to just always be craving,
Yeah.
because then I end up in this perpetual state of always wanting more and always longing and never
Mm.
feeling content with what exists and what I have.
Yeah.
So there is some tension there for me. I'm not sure that I know the answer.
Well, I like that you named all three of those things because it almost feels as though they all exist at the same time. So we have this longing and craving. We have a sense of like a misunderstanding. We're not quite really understanding the truth of what is. And some of those belief systems and structures around, these identities that we kind of take on that aren't really our truest, most authentic expression of ourselves. We have these attachments to these identities because of these very strong belief structures. So that third, leg of the stool around maybe a misunderstanding is here that I'm not really aware of. And that tying into this kind of the middle piece around what am I resisting? What am I not trying to look at? What am I avoiding? Or what have I decided I am against? Or so it's almost as though these three pieces need to kind of be in existence all at the same time to create a bit of it creates movement. I mean, I feel like it otherwise we would just be kind of floating around in space, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I like that you mentioned these three pieces because as we talk about them individually, it almost feels as though focusing on just one leg of the stool might also create more suffering because you're losing sight of how all these components might fit together in some way.
Yeah, it is. It's something I feel like they're three aspects of the same thing.
Yeah.
Kind of the way that like in the late 19th century, scientists, physicists realized that electricity and magnetism are like two aspects of the same thing, which are these like E&M waves. I feel like these three things, they're so interconnected. They are just aspects of the same thing,
Mm.
which I don't know if there's like some fundamental suffering thing that occurs, but I do feel like they're all tied together
Well,
very
it's
closely.
interesting to talk about it this way because we start getting into like the paradox and the metaphor of things where we can talk about each of these pieces individually, and that can have a lot of value to understand them that way. But then eventually you start getting into this space of like things start to be conflicting or it's like, well, how can this be true and that be true?
Mhm.
And it seems as though the further you move through these kinds of understanding and cognitive structures, you start to move more towards the way of feeling connected and interacting with other human beings and nature and life in general from this more sensory body place. And some of these mental understanding structures kind of fall away, and you start to realize that you're experiencing things more energetically. And to your point, I do think you start to arrive into a sense and a direct experience of like connection and is everything just energy? Are we all just like emitting vibrational waves? So that sense of everything being some kind of unified expression, I think is also true. So I always find it interesting to kind of toggle back and forth between this sense of, oh, I'm a separate being. Oh, no, I'm in unity and like everything in between. But I think it does speak to what you're saying. Like a lot of philosophers, a lot of different areas of investigating the experience we're all in often lead to a place of it's all the same thing. It's all unity.
Yeah, so with that, what is like, who is Joe? What's the Joe that's like in your head
Mhm.
looking out? What is that?
So I think I mentioned to you I'm an internal family systems therapist,
Mhm.
and IFS does a really good job giving a good structure or mechanism to kind of have this kind of discussion of who am I? And this idea of having sub personalities, different parts of me, the question, who is Joe? If I were to pause and just get a sense of like the experience of myself, I often feel like there's a me, the me behind my eyes.
Mhm.
And there's almost like a location of sensing, oh, the me is up here somewhere. And I think everyone experiences themselves in different ways, but that can be a useful thing to notice of like, where are you inside yourself? Where are you looking from? Where are you perceiving from? How are you responding to things? And so for me, a starting point of there's an identity of myself that lives behind my eyes, what I feel is like my kind of my set point, my baseline perception of myself. But I can move that locus of attention to other places. I can go into my body and sense and feel that I'm actually looking and feeling from my heart.
Mhm.
And then, well, what happened to the guy behind my eyes, you know?
Right.
Um, so it can be an interesting exploration to start to consider that we're multiplicitous beings. We have different identities or parts of ourselves, aspects of ourselves that have filters and ways of engaging with each other and ourselves. So, cognitive filters, emotional filters, body sensory kind of filters. Those are all me, but it can be interesting to start to track, what do I attach my identity to? Am I the one that's thinking? Am I the one that's feeling? Am I the one that, when I'm moving and dancing and expressing myself is just like pure energy? So IFS would say, yes, you are all those things. And as you investigate these different parts of you, and almost like a mindfulness practice where you start to kind of pause and notice, who is this? What do you want to tell me? What do you have these kind of inner dialogues? Behind all these kind of structures of identity is a more calm, open, present, capital S self, your higher self.
Mhm.
So to answer your question, I would say who I am is like a multiplicitous being. I have various aspects of myself that I've really tried to dive into and understand better as filters. And I can do a bit of an exercise where I see myself as these separate pieces. But my intention more these days is I'm really wanting to kind of see myself as an integrated being of kind of multiplicitous aspects. And there's kind of this deeper capital S self, higher consciousness, awareness, me that's functioning in the world through all these different filters of me. So I don't know. That's kind of a long, drawn out answer, but I guess that's how I would
Mhm.
answer who am I? That question.
Yeah, I like that. I've learned some about IFS, and so I know this conception of the parts and kind of organizing things in that way. But I like this thought of like filtering the real you who's behind all of this like open awareness,
Yeah.
filtering that through these different parts.
Yeah.
I hadn't considered it in that way before, but that feels right.
Yeah, in my work with people, it does kind of feel like you're making your way behind something. And I have some friends in Austin that we have these conversations quite a bit where we're always talking about, well, what's behind all that? And the me that's behind all that. As you notice these different belief structures, ways I've identified myself as wounded, or parts of me that want to make myself better, parts that are a bit reactive triggered, parts that are overanalyzing and overthinking all the time, parts that are vulnerable and perhaps carry some energy of fear or a lack of trust. Yeah, these are all different dimensions of me that IFS offers this process where you can kind of try to slow all that down and come into relationship with these different parts of you and speak to them as if they have their own identity. So, speaking to that wounded child, or speaking to my overanalyzing mind, or speaking to my nervous system that seems to be kind of like in an agitated or fearful state. And there's this way I can be in relationship to these dimensions of me from this deeper awareness, the thing that's behind all that. So yeah, IFS as a model and a structure to kind of navigate all these things has been really useful for me.
So to jump back to suffering,
Yep.
I'm curious about your attitude towards suffering. Is it something that I should strive to overcome or avoid or not suffer, or do you think it serves some valuable purpose?
So I think a certain level of suffering is necessary and part of the design of this experience that we're all in. I certainly don't deeply understand why everything is the way it is. I've done a number of medicine journeys, and there's been times when I ask God, why? Why is it this way? If the whole point is to be in unity, then why are we experiencing all this separateness and suffering? And I haven't quite gotten an answer yet. But to the point we were saying earlier, these kind of three-legged stool things, how much of this suffering is because you're resisting something, right? But also the component of suffering and resistance is a necessary like mechanism to almost direct you towards looking at misinformation or how you may be viewing something without accuracy, how you may be avoiding and resisting the truth of what is and not really aware of who you really are. So I would say there's a component of suffering or this tension that's necessary. But I think that we could also prolong our suffering. We can intensify our suffering because of the ways we approach this. If we're avoidant, if we're resistant, that creates more suffering. And how much of that is necessary? I would argue probably not a lot. I mean, ideally, not everyone maybe has this privilege or access to resources, but to try to mitigate those levels of intense suffering, I think is important and also necessary to try to relieve suffering or not be in suffering. And there's this innate drive in us to not suffer. But as I mentioned, I think that there's a certain level of suffering that is part of this experience that we're all in. And if that suffering is resistance to what is, if that suffering is a misunderstanding of who we really are, or that suffering is, what's the third thing? Whatever the third thing is. Um,
Ignorance.
what's that?
Ignorance, a
Yeah,
misunderstanding.
like those can be addressed. Like we can actually impact the amount of suffering that we endure. And that's a very powerful thing to acknowledge that we have a sense of autonomy, responsibility, accountability, and power to relieve our own suffering and the suffering of others. And the process of learning all these skills and tools, in my own experience, I feel as though I'm at a place in my life where I've had the opportunity and resources and privilege to learn some things and maybe I can offer that to someone else and make their suffering a little less. So yeah, I think it can be necessary. There can be ways we intensify it through our own actions. I think suffering also draws our attention to the body. I think that there can be ways I've noticed where I feel and sense I'm really deeply suffering. And as I go inside and pay attention to that, it's actually so many layers of like cognitive noise that is kind of magnifying a sense of suffering, which is more around fear or a lack of safety or a concern around belonging or a desire for connection that's not available. And those are real emotional feelings, those have impact. But the layers of thinking on top of that kind of intensify the suffering. So oftentimes I'll feel I'm kind of adding to the suffering in ways that maybe aren't really necessary. It's almost like that whole second arrow metaphor, there's like the first arrow and the injury into your body, and then the second arrow is you're just constantly thinking about it or the impact of it and the ways you're kind of processing the wound. Yeah. And I think the last thing I'll say about suffering is it grabs your attention, and the mechanism in us that is our attention, where we put our attention, how we move our attention around, that thing of the I am that's looking out and giving our attention to something. So suffering demands our attention, and it often requires us to be with it in some way. And again, I think it's a very powerful, necessary mechanism of, you know, perhaps spiritual growth is to have our attention and demand our attention in such a way that it's inviting us to look deeper and maybe a path towards self-discovery or awakening or something.
Have you ever taken the Vipassana meditation course?
That has been mentioned to me many times, and tell me more about it because I'm just like, I need to check this out. It keeps being mentioned to me, but yeah.
Yeah, I really think it would be cool. I just did one. I got back like a week ago. So it's 10 days and they teach you this method of meditation, which is, like an ancient practice, but it's so relevant, especially to a lot of the things you're saying, because the whole practice is just understanding your body,
Mm,
like feeling sensations in the body, understanding just what is going on all the time and learning to not react.
yeah.
And one of the things that they have you do during this course is what they call aditana, which is it's a Pali word. I just butchered it, I'm sure, but it means strong determination. And so what that means is for these like hour sessions, you're sitting in one posture. They say, don't open your legs, don't open your hands, don't open your eyes. You're just gonna sit.
Yeah.
And it gets so painful. It's like, especially so I'm pretty bad at sitting cross-legged. Like, my body just doesn't work that way,
Mhm.
and so most of the time, I would kneel and then have, like, cushions under my butt, but the few times that I did sit cross-legged, it was brutal. Like, my hips would start hurting at, like, 30 minutes, and I got, like, a firsthand experience of this suffering, which was the key thing I noticed was when I was in there with the pain, when I was just feeling the pain, just noticing, like, okay, there's these, like, different pieces of it. There's this part that's, like, bright and, like, really pulling my attention, and then there's this, like, dullness behind it. That there wasn't suffering in that. It was like me being curious about it and
Mm,
me just experiencing it. And it was only when all of a sudden my brain would go to like, when is this going to be over? When can I stop feeling this? How can I move my legs? Then all of a sudden I would notice this like suffering and this like clear awareness of like how much time has passed and this longing and all these three things that we talked about, the craving, ignorance, aversion. But they only come up when I am outside of the pain, when I'm, like, thinking about the pain,
mhm.
wishing the pain would go away. So, yeah, I like how that gives, because I think pain is there are lots of forms of suffering that are not from physical pain, obviously,
Yeah.
but physical pain is an easy it's like the simplest form, I would say. Like, you can make it happen. It's simpler to notice and practice with than, like, emotional pain. That's, like, a little bit more complicated and a little trickier to deal with.
Yeah. Well, and physical pain or physical pain is a necessary component of growth and expansion. I mean, if you think of like a workout, break your muscles down so that they can improve and get stronger and get bigger. And flexibility and strength are both a process of breaking things down to achieve more range and motion and strength and capacity in your body. And I think it's a really good metaphor, actually, to talk about a path to capacity, flexibility, strength on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, requires things to break down, requires ego states and our attachment to things that we're holding on to because we're afraid if we let go, something bad will happen, and that fear and that mechanism of the holding on is a big component of the suffering. And the surrender and the stepping into and towards something that we've been avoiding or we misunderstood or we're afraid of, the intensity of that suffering can soften. I think the value of this practice that you're talking about, I can really see what you mean, where you're using your physical body to show you a path and a relationship to suffering.
Mhm.
And I think one of the challenges in our modern culture, and I see this in a lot of like, men's groups, there's a certain way suffering is held, maybe two different ways. Like, let's get it, like just all the like intensity of just facing the demons and like going to battle and the warrior's, journey and like the value seen in that as an imperative and doing it in groups and with other men. And so stepping towards that kind of resistance as a way to kind of forge your sense of power and your autonomy and your ability and capacity. But there's almost like an attachment to it. There's almost like this is what it means to be a man, is to be a warrior and to fight the battle and to show up with all your armor and to have your weapons, and that there can be almost this idealization of that way of being. And equally, what would it be like to just be open and vulnerable and not have armor and to just be in complete surrender of like the chaos of life, to not be in control, I guess. So I think it can be really valuable to look at all sides of this thing around suffering and build capacity, build the ability to like sit in this position and what you might feel like you're suffering through that. But in the process of being with that physical pain, you can kind of get to the behind that place and soften maybe some of the mind things that are increasing the suffering, and learn some tools of what I would call capacity, where you have a capacity to be with these sensations in your body, to be with emotional discomfort, to be with other people that are in very extreme reactive responses, to be with your own kind of extreme dimensions of yourself, and to be in presence to, I mean, I guess maybe another point of the necessity of suffering and how it draws your attention is this process of learning how to be still and be present, be calm, and have this capacity to be with the chaos of life, the beauty of life, the order of life, the dynamics of relationship to each other and ourselves. And yeah, I think I like to tie it back to capacity oftentimes when we're talking about it.
So where do these parts come from in your conception? Like with IFS, are they all wounds, or like do you start off as just like a baby that's just like this open perfect consciousness, or yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. I like to kind of bring in a few different theories because I think that all these developmental models around, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and like Erickson's stages of development with a child, and there's these places in your life where, I mean, certainly as a baby, your nervous system is kind of like this open source. You just think you're part of everything, you know? And so when something happens that disrupts a sense of like safety or belonging or connection, you take your sensory mind and body takes it in as like, that's me. Like I'm impacting myself. I am losing connection with myself. You see your mother or these attachment figures or caretakers as an extension of you. So I mention that because early on, if you have these, what I would say, either traumatic or disruptions in your developmental process, your mind and your body come online to try to adapt to that situation and make sense of it. So, part of these parts of us are coping mechanisms, or these parts of us are a set of belief structures that, oh, maybe I grew up without a father. And so my lived experience as a child or, through these developmental stages is that I am very confused about masculinity or what it is to be a man, or I don't understand, you know, the the experience of feeling disconnected and lost and alone from the masculine or whatever. So parts are adaptive structures. They can be cognitive, they can be physical, emotional, your nervous system. If you think of like the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses that our nervous system does, those kind of impulses and very natural responses can become kind of fixed in time or stuck in time in relationship to an experience of our lives and become like a part. So a part of me as a 12-year-old that was bullied, or, a teenager who's a rebel, or, the kid who's just aloof all the time and avoidant. These can be kind of like identities that we become kind of formulated at certain times in our lives. So it's useful to kind of consider that these places in time, they're like a placeholder with a part of us that has a belief, a story, a situation, and that begins often at certain points in our lives as a part, and then we carry it forward. So as an adult, I still have a part of me I call Chicken Little. It's like this nervous system kind of anxious kid who, doesn't really fit in and is afraid. And, it's a part of me that's been carried forward since the moment in time where I had that first response of like an anxious reaction to my environment. So parts can be formed. I think we have innate parts of us that aren't really traumatized, that aren't really stuck in some kind of proactive or reactive response. So I think we have parts of us that are open and vulnerable and playful. And, think of a young child, typically they don't have to learn how to like laugh. It just comes spontaneously. They don't have to learn how to, feel hurt. So our emotions are all kind of innate to us. But what makes them apart is when they become kind of extreme or kind of stuck in time or carry a bunch of belief systems around what's true or not true. So it's interesting because it kind of ties back to this three-legged stool thing where there can be these innate dimensions of us that have their own kind of qualities, but if there's belief systems attached to them, fear structures attached to them, or unresolved questions or misunderstandings about life in general, then they become kind of this solidified thing that wants our attention?
How do you personally recognize when you are, like, operating from a part?
Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for me to be blended with my parts because that can be a whole part in itself to judge myself for being, a part. So if I'm in some kind of reaction, usually that's a part. If I'm not engaged in the present as it is, I'm kind of interpreting what's happening and then responding to some interpretation that generally signals to me that I'm in some kind of part structure.
Mhm.
So am I calm? Am I open? Am I present? Am I in a bit of like the flow of things, comfortable with things adapting and just moving through life without necessarily feeling triggered or overwhelmed or responding? I think all those things are indications that some part of me is online trying to like be a filter to the experience that's actually happening. And the counterbalance to that, I believe, is presence. So whatever's going on, can I settle more into my physical body, experience what's actually going on, notice what's really happening here in the present moment? Then most of my part structures kind of soften and I can come into more contact with what I would call this kind of higher self, higher consciousness, this present aware being of me that can, yeah, participate and engage in life as it is.
Yeah, I find it's pretty difficult to notice, for me at least, when I am reacting or in that kind
Mhm,
of state where a certain part has taken over.
mhm.
And I like what you say about the judgment and not berating or, you know, not believing that there's anything wrong with that, but also I appreciate the awareness around it. But I do often have that experience where, like, I, like, come to, and I'm like, What the fuck was that?" I just, like, was someone else for a little bit, like, that was completely, like, 15-year-old me
Yeah,
operating that,
totally.
for a while.
Mhm.
But the presence is good. That's, yeah, definitely for me, breathing, that resets, the nervous system,
Yeah.
calms me down a little, and then getting into the body. Very
Yeah,
solid.
I think our nervous system regulation is a really deep foundational skill set and toolkit that we would highly benefit from paying attention to,
Mhm.
finding ways to feel regulated and calm and present. And then, like you said, then you can you start to become aware of like, oh shit, I was just really in the weeds right there. Or I just, got into some crazy argument with my husband about loading the dishwasher. And what was that about?
Mhm.
You just notice all these very kind of extreme reactive states and you can start to build like evidence and possibility of not being in those states as often and have a practice of being present and regulated and actually just trying to navigate things differently, trying to connect to people, build friendships or relationships. Well, right now I have quite a bit going on with my mom. She's a pretty religious person. And I'm really attempting to look at that and see what's going on in me with this tension in our relationship where I feel as though, she's always judging me. And underneath that layer of the part of me that's like upset and angry that she's judging me and, all of the ways that why aren't you going to church anymore? And, why haven't you met the right girl? Whatever she's
Mhm.
perceiving should happen for me, I'm feeling the impact of her resistance to see me as I am. And that becomes a story that I'm holding on to, right? So I'm responding to that story rather than when I visit home, just being with her and like just having a conversation, like what's actually happening in the present moment with her while she's sitting there knitting and hanging out in the couch. I
Mhm.
have all this stuff going on in my mind that I'm like so ready to go to battle with her about. So I'm really investigating like, okay, so there's a layer here of a bunch of story. There's actually my own self-judgment towards myself because there's a part of me that wishes I did believe everything that she believed. Wishes that I was straight because there's this illusion that maybe our life and our relationship would just be easier. And then this deeper, vulnerable, intense kind of like, man, I don't want to be gay. And almost like these places of like, oh, there's a lot of this energy that I'm holding against myself. And so it comes to a process of self-acceptance of instead of projecting onto my mom that she's rejecting me, what aspect of me is rejecting me?
Mhm.
And can I go to that place and really understand all the things that it learned to be true and all the values that it was taught? And it's just a structure of my mind trying to make sense of the world that has nothing to do with what I'm physically, emotionally expressing as authentically myself. Not really sure what got me onto that whole thing, but I forget what the question was.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know
It's
either.
good. I can very much relate to that though. Maybe not on such a fundamental level, but recently I had a like experience with my mom, and if she hears this, hopefully she knows I love her and all that. But I recently I've been meaning to quit my job for a while, and it finally came to a point where like an opportunity came to me that just made so much sense. It was like, I'm gonna quit my job now. I'm gonna leave. And I shared it with her, and I was very excited because of this thing that had happened that gave me this chance to leave how I had been planning to, and I was finally gonna do it. And I kind of just got like the opposite reaction from her, which was not excitement. It was like it was more anxiety. And it was
Hmm.
like,
Yeah.
well, what's gonna happen? Are you sure that you can find a job if you need one? And all these things piled up. And rather than just like being with her in that moment and recognizing that she's going through an anxious experience, like that's just what's happening. My mind went to like, okay, how can I like show her
Hmm.
exactly why this is the right decision?
Right.
But in that moment, it was just that was just an emotional experience for her. That was
Yeah.
all it was.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
so and then later that night, I'm like thinking through it again and like convincing myself why I'm making the right decision, all these things, and like, oh,
Hmm.
here's how I can like convince her.
Hmm.
But none of that like cognitive jujitsu is necessary.
Yeah. Totally.
It's just emotion, and it's
Yeah.
just being with her in that, and knowing also, like you were saying, recognizing that there's a part of me that is taking on her rejection of my
Mhm.
decision as my own,
Yeah.
and noticing that and being with that part.
Yeah. And I think as you just did, there were some layers there that you made sense of, and you realize, oh, I'm actually trying to convince myself
Mhm.
that this is a good choice. And amidst her response of being a mother who's just worried about her kid and wants, that's been the most useful thing for me with my mother is like putting myself all the ways I wanted her to put herself in my shoes so that she understands me and she loves me unconditionally and all the things that I'm like, I want her to do all this stuff. It's like, oh, I could do that for her. Like I could step
Mhm.
into her shoes and acknowledge, I mean, she freaking raised 8 children. She's has a heart of gold. She's very kind. We all get along. She did her best. She grew up in the 50s, I mean, her perspective and lens of sexuality and like human nature and these are all developments that came way beyond her education experience. And so And she does genuinely love and care about me, and just as a mother wants me to be okay, you know? She just wants me to be okay. And that kind of worried mom thing, man, I if I could step into her shoes and get a sense and feel of, like, what it would be like to be feel responsible for 8 human beings, you know, and like for their well-being and want them to be okay and want them to have enough money and eat enough and to have a level of happiness. You know, she really wants that. And I can kind of see that worried look on her face and that sense of suffering that she's got around our relationship has more to do with internal struggles of like being a mother and what she believes my life experience might be like, and just a deep love for me and wanting me to be okay, you know?
Mhm.
So when there's that context of her having her own experience and letting her be who she is, and me not having to like fix that about her, these other levels of me being with the parts of me that are holding criticism and judgment, and places inside that are just honestly, I think the deepest piece of it was I realized, oh, I'm holding on to this belief that I still want to believe what they believe. I still want to see the world the way my mom does, because somewhere inside there's a small child that thinks that that's how you love someone, is you share their experience and their beliefs, and that's what love is, you know?
Mhm.
That's what connection is. So yeah, all the I think originally we were asking about like being with parts and understanding your own mental structures and parts and things. As with a lot of life in general, it's a practice. There are practices of understanding who you are, understanding why we're here, trying to navigate life in a way so you can get what you need and meet these base kind of needs around connection and love and belonging and safety and trust and autonomy. And yeah, it's all a journey.
Yeah. Yeah, I found this is kind of coming off this meditation retreat course that I did. They talk a lot about compassion, and especially compassion toward people who do wrong to
Mm,
you. Because
mm,
that was something with the situation with my mom where later that night I'm like, why is she not like supporting me? Why is she not
mm.
accepting this decision? Like it felt like she had done something wrong to me.
Right.
And recognizing when people do wrong, quote unquote, wrong to you, that they suffer more than you do. Like
Mm,
that fundamentally there is a suffering that occurs whenever you do, like whenever you harm someone in, whatever way. And in her case, it was like, well, like I said, it was this anxiety.
yeah.
And so when I was able to break it down to that and feel compassion towards her,
Yeah.
and that she is going through a difficult experience that was, triggered by me doing this thing, but that's kind of out of that doesn't matter. It's she's going through something challenging. She's suffering.
Yeah.
Putting it in the lens of compassion like dissolves everything else.
Totally. And it gives you an opportunity to come into the present experience with your mom. You know, I can come into that present experience of sitting in the living room and she's knitting, and she's obviously distraught because she has that worried look on her face, but she's a mother. It's part of her,
Mhm.
journey as a mom to care for her children and want them to be okay. And her religious beliefs, part of that is she holds a sense of responsibility of getting her children to heaven. Another thing I want to just say about this is the belief structures that we hold on to can be a direct relationship to these levels of suffering. And when we believe someone has injured us, look at what it is you believe has happened, what it is you believe about yourself, what it is you believe about the other person, and notice that those are all cognitive, meaning making components of your mind, and that they may not be true. And there's another model that I really enjoy, and it's called stages. And it's a developmental model for your mind, how your mind goes through these meaning making developmental stages. Early on, it's all about belonging to like your family and your community. And so your mind takes on very specific belief structures so that can be true. Well, you go off to college and you realize, oh, I'm my own person. I'm not, these are all the ways I'm not like my family. These are all the ways you're trying to individuate and become more of an autonomous and understand who you are as an individual. And then you go through this period of like, I'm my own person, you're not the boss of me. And like, that's a very important stage to go through
Uh-huh.
to kind of individualize and come into your own sense of, like, power and, ability and capacity. And then you come full circle to this other place, maybe late adulthood, where you start to feel like you want to be back in connection to your family or community, or you start to kind of reminisce or the good old days and how easy it used to be. But there's this cycle of going to individualization back into connection and community, and it kind of weaves back and forth. So you do that, this kind of individual community process, and on top of that is a lot of mental structures of like, how do I become more myself versus how do I become more in connection with everyone else? And oftentimes, to become part of the community, you have to give up pieces of yourself. You have to acknowledge, like, oh, well, this piece of me doesn't really fit to belong here. So I have to put that aside. And so these meaning making structures, when you hold them in the context of like belonging and connection versus individuation and like, I'm my own person, you can start to see kind of the complexity of it all. But I always like to kind of question, what do I believe is true right now? What's causing this tension? And is there something about my beliefs that I can stay open to other possibilities? What else is possible that I'm not acknowledging as another truth? So I like to throw that into the mix.
Hmm.
Let's talk about your book. So,
Okay, sweet.
yeah, tell me, because I've just heard about it. I feel like I haven't I haven't heard from you what actually went into the book and
Yeah,
yeah, what the whole purpose of it is.
yeah, great. So I co authored this book, From Broken to Badass, and it's integrating internal family systems and somatic experiencing to heal and get real. And the idea is using IFS structures to kind of understand the meaning making machine and high level coping mechanisms and all the ways you adapt. It's kind of a summary of what we've been talking about today using IFS, and then also structures around being in the body and your nervous system. And the intention of this book is my co author, Kate West. She and I share a bunch of personal stories. We're kind of just sharing the journey. Like, hey, this is what we've kind of learned and know about living our lives. And maybe this can be useful to share with others.
Uh-huh.
Understanding these high level coping mechanisms that we all live under, being attuned to your body and your sensory nervous system, and how to kind of find tools and ways to regulate to be in relationship. And then it goes to like this third place around, well, what would it be like if we were all a little more regulated, a little more less traumatized? And our kind of, is the human species on this like verge of another evolutionary leap? If we were all had a skill set to kind of heal and be less traumatized, and we're all a little bit higher up on the hierarchy of needs and able to kind of like be in relationship to each other from more connecting, present ways of being, what's possible for us as a species? Is it possible that we would be in less conflict and we would be in more pursuit of connection and love and presence with each other, and more of a collaborative
Uh-huh.
experience of life? So, yeah, the book's intended to, my hope is that I can kind of raise the bar a little bit more in the collective understanding of who you are and how you're designed, and maybe give
Right.
people some baseline skills of how to like regulate and understand themselves. There's lots of exercises, and we'll be selling the book with a workbook and some meditations, and eventually we want to do an online course to kind of just, it's kind of like my offering, how Kate and I wanted to like combine our skill set and offer something as a way to give back and, try to help others.
What was your biggest takeaway from writing the book or co-writing the book?
Co-writing a book is a whole thing. um, there were a lot of elements in the actual process of writing the book, and getting the relationship with our marketing publisher person was very challenging. So yeah, we were parts triggered by parts the entire time, right?
You have to
So as we're
practice it.
writing the book, we're trying to use what we're putting in the book to kind of like navigate and stay regulated. And I think my biggest takeaway is I realize how I've really been operating under this premise of is like me against the world. I'm a pretty smart guy. I've done a lot of work on myself. And I feel like I've kind of done this major pendulum swing towards this individuation place. And a lot of my direct experience is like, I don't want to do this alone, I want to be in community and in connection with other people. So having a collaborative experience with Kate really taught me like, oh, I think this is what it's about. It's about actually doing things with
Uh,
people.
mhm.
So these podcasts opportunities, just reaching out to people, trying to collaborate more, be less in my own little bubble. Um, so I'm excited. I feel like I've turned a page towards collaborating and co-creating things with other people, and so it feels like a step in that direction for me. Yeah,
What does your dream life look like?
my dream life. It's probably not too far off from where I am at the moment. I feel extremely grateful for all the incredible opportunities and things that I've been able to navigate. Part of launching this book was I had a life where I had this private practice, working from home on Zoom, spending a lot of time in my bubble. So I think my dream life is to connect with more people, maybe run some retreats and workshops and offer a bigger container, maybe go bigger, be more expressed and engaged in life, and kind of trust life a little more. Maybe not be so controlling and hyper vigilant, to soften some of those edges around like maybe it's okay to like trust life a little bit and lean into the
Yeah.
mystery, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, we do live in a world where that's, I mean, at least in America, it's
Yeah.
pretty safe to lean into life.
Yeah.
I could see like from an evolutionary standpoint, maybe that's not the best idea, but where we are now, there is that
Mm.
option
Yeah.
to just kind of give in to the unknown and recognize that. So like pretty certain that will be okay.
Yeah. Like again, the life I have at the moment is pretty freaking high level, and there's a lot to be grateful for.
Mhm.
And the journey of what happened to me and why am I suffering, and I think every person has their own journey. And like I said, I'm hopeful to get to a place where I can maybe be in more support of others.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Joe. Do you
Yeah,
want to
brother.
mention where people can find you, where the book will be, all that?
Yeah, so the book will have and has a website from brokentobadass.com. And right now we're still working out the shipping and the printing of the book, so it's all pre-order at the moment. But we're doing like there's an audiobook and some meditations and a workbook and a little survival guide. There's some little giveaways, I guess, with it at the moment.
Cool.
So that's a good place. I have my own website as well, joebielling.com. And yeah, hopefully I'll see people around Austin and or maybe at some kind of retreat or workshop or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you again, Joe. I
All right,
appreciate you.
brother. Thank you so much for the time and attention. I appreciate what you're doing.
Bye, everybody.